Hello, everybody. This is Mark Matousek, and I hope you're having a great day. Today, we're going to be talking about originality and the importance of allowing what's most unique and authentic and particular in ourselves to show up in the world without fear or self-sabotage. Even though originality is difficult in the best of times, in today's media saturated world of branding and memes and so on, the call to avoid imitation and march to our own drummer can be especially difficult. And that's why it's all the more important to resist being manipulated by Big Brother, to trust our genuine affinities and our originality to guide us where we're meant to go. Even though each of us wears many masks in a lifetime, there's also a quality that's unique to every one of us and endures behind our various roles and incarnations. In his poem, The Layers, Stanley Kunitz describes this interplay between what's lasting and what's momentary in us in a very beautiful way. He writes, quote, "I have walked through many lives, some of them my own, and I am not who I was, though some principle of being abides from which I struggle not to stray." Isn't that beautiful? Some principle of being which I struggle not to stray. This principle of being is what we're addressing today, the spiritual and emotional through line that connects the dots of our various lives. As a memoir writer, I've spent decades tracing the narratives of my own existence, and I'm intensely aware of this principle of being and how it has followed me through my own changes. I can look back at journals from 10 or 20 or 30 years ago and hear the same patterns, emotions, and inflections in the writing, a kind of me-ness, M-E-N-E-S-S, that hasn't really changed much at all. Every human being has such a distinctive me-ness that deserves their attention and affection and care. That's not the same as self-cherishing, which spiritual traditions warn against. Self-cherishing means being bound to our personalities and in love with our transitory self at the expense of our deeper spiritual identity. In fact, it's only possible to honor our uniqueness and individuality when we realize that we're more than this personality, that we're more than this me story. Only when we realize that we are the spirit animating the puppet show can we value our puppet without mistaking it for our real self. Now, this is an important point that spiritual absolutists tend to miss. Focused on the absolute, they neglect and lose touch with the value of the immanent, the material, and the formed. Fixated on transcendence, they can undervalue the magic of being an embodied spirit in a limited idiosyncratic form. Yet it's precisely through the form, through the particular shape of the individual, that the divine can express itself in recognizable and very poignant ways. When I think about the spiritual masters that I've been fortunate enough to spend time with over the years, for example, I realize how moving and human it is to watch this spirit come through their various personal and very different forms. The subtle beauty of the Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh is as different from the passionate intensity of the Sufi master Pir Vilayat Khan as a lute is from a saxophone. Byron Katie's lion tamer personality has very little in common with Eckhart Tolle's gnomic mischief and intellect, although their essence is the same. As St. Martin reminds us, quote, "All mystics speak the same language as they come from the same country," unquote. So while their instruments create different types of music, they share the one breath of creation. Because these masters are unattached to their own forms, they're able to inhabit them fully. And that's why awakened individuals are so earthy and simple and completely themselves. They tend to be natural and funny and self-deprecating and very playful. Being free of the need to compete or compare and immune to the notion of imitation. Spiritual masters are free to be as they are, without ego and without apology. But what about the rest of us? How can we learn to stand on our own 2 feet and appreciate the view from our personal platform? How can we interrupt the tendency toward reflexive imitation and competition and envy that leads to so much unhappiness? I'm going to talk to you today about 5 different practices that open the path to originality and authenticity. Each of these calls on a form of tolerance that loosens the ego's resistance and fear and fosters individual well-being. So let's begin with the first practice, which is tolerance of your lot in life. What does it mean to tolerate our lot in life? Does it mean that we should become resigned or complacent? Stop wanting to improve and expand and learn and grow? No, of course not. But until we can tolerate who we are in this moment, we can't make effective change in our life. As long as we're rejecting, denying, or pushing away conditions that we find incomplete or unpleasant, tolerance remains conditional. I will tolerate myself if this or that happens. I'll accept my lot if I get a guarantee that all of it can be radically changed. We can't embrace ourselves with one hand and make room in our heart for ourselves as we are, while rejecting ourselves with the other. And that's why personal change so often fails, because we're sending the universe, so to speak, mixed messages that cancel one another out before they can manifest. For example, I know a woman who's been on a diet for 50 years. Now, while this may not seem like a spiritual problem, it does go, in fact, to the heart of her faith in God and in life and in herself. This woman gains and loses weight compulsively and measures her personal value according to what she sees on the scale. When she's heavy, she lives in a state of self-judgment, comparing herself to smaller women, envying their metabolism, and resenting the world at large, where Zavtik isn't always a celebrated body type. When she's thin, on the other hand, she's anxious about staying thin and terrified about gaining a pound. She works overtime to imitate the ways of the super fit and feels uncomfortable in her own body, which she views as an unreliable partner. This internal conflict between the devil and angel in herself keeps this well-meaning woman on a dieting seesaw. For all the time and effort she has invested in losing the weight, she's never applied the same attention to balancing her inner life. She's never learned to tolerate herself as she is, whether she's overweight or svelte. She's never learned to tolerate herself as an endomorphic person with a particular body type. And in an effort to hide this, she conceals the fullness of her personality as well, including this wonderful loud laugh that she has, that she stifles because she's playing it small. She doesn't want to attract attention. The truth is that even when she's thin, she feels fat inside because she's never been able to take a step back from her physical identity to recognize that this is not all of who she is, so as to become more comfortable in her skin. You can apply this same principle to anything about yourself that you refuse to make space for, fearing that if you accept yourself, you might lose the desire for self-improvement. This is the opposite of the truth. Until we expand to make room for our whole self in all its colors, we can't find our way to tolerance, and we will continue to stifle ourselves out of fear and judgment. So ask yourself, what aspects of your own lot in life do you have trouble tolerating? Where does your compassion stop? Where does your empathy for yourself stop? Where do you leave yourself outside the circle of care? This is very important to investigate, and try to be as specific as possible when you answer these questions. The next practice is to tolerate inconsistency and contradiction. In an effort to be good people, quote unquote, We do our best to neutralize our contradictions, to be consistent in thought and deed. But unfortunately, as human beings, this is virtually impossible. The fact is that we are walking contradictions, made up of many different levels and parts. And we're born to be changeable and permeable, and inconsistent, and predictably irrational. This is the same point that Ralph Waldo Emerson famously made when he said that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Aspiring to a foolish consistency at the expense of truthfulness and authenticity is a trap. It means attempting to freeze ourselves in place and refusing to move with circumstances as they change, to lean into the dance of life instead of being afraid to move. When we attempt to deny or neutralize contradiction, it means cutting away or covering up one part of ourselves or another in hopes of creating a kind of perpetual harmony, as if life itself could ever be completely harmonious. When we do this, it means being sensible rather than being honest. The human need to make sense of ourselves always carries the danger of leaving out what doesn't make sense, including the passions and the proclivities that don't seem to fit. As the psychologist D.W. Winnicott said, we are poor indeed if we are only sane. We're poor indeed if we are only sane. The drive to make sense, to do away with our wild parts and appear rational and balanced and logical, arises from the fear of powerlessness, of course, in a world that we can't control. This can become a particular problem in spiritual life when we try to be too pure or too good, too simple or too one-dimensional. When we attempt to downplay the human shadow, as we've said so many times in the Seeker's Forum, and with all of its complexity, we lose essential parts of ourselves. It's only when we can tolerate inconsistency that we can stop imitating plaster saints and allow ourselves to be complicated, imperfect, contradictory, and sometimes inconsistent. In other words, humble and humane beings. So ask yourself, what personal inconsistencies and contradictions do you refuse to tolerate and why? What would they reveal about you that you feel the need to hide? Why are you so attached to control? When and why are you especially rigid? These are excellent questions to explore for yourself. The next practice has to do with tolerating disapproval from others. This is extremely important. As long as we're devoted to pleasing other people and living up to their standards, we can't be grown-up, self-reliant, forthcoming people. With our sights focused on outside reactions, we can't trust the still small voice within ourselves or the promptings of our own spirit. When you find yourself looking up to others, it means that you're looking at the world through the eyes of a child and waiting for permission to be yourself. Though it resembles humility from the outside, this fixation on being universally loved and approved of is actually an insidious form of egotism, even a form of manipulation at times. It can lead to not taking responsibility for our own choices. It can enable us to project our lack of self-approval onto others, which only deepens our insecurity and the feeling of living on tenterhooks, of being imprisoned by the people around us, dependent on their whims. I know a guy like this who refuses to make decisions or state his position, or, God forbid, disagree with anyone, lest he be rejected or judged. In his case, this stems from insecure parental attachment and being bullied when he was a kid. For him to be pushed outside of the group is tantamount to being killed. He fears that he'll be alone forever. No one will love him if people disapprove of the choices that he makes. And so he doesn't make choices. Instead, he lives in a state of arrested development like a frightened kid. When we do the work of self-acceptance and confront the ways that we disapprove of ourselves and then resolve those internal conflicts, we become proportionately less concerned with other people's opinions. So ask yourself, when and why do you fear other people's disapproval? How does this fear reflect a lack of self-acceptance or tolerance of your own imperfections? What stories of rejection, danger, shame, or judgment do these fears trigger in you? Try to be as specific as possible in your answers. The fourth practice, which is akin to the third, is to tolerate the distance between yourself and other people. The distance between yourself and other people. One of the reasons that we try so hard to imitate the people around us is to create an illusion of non-separation, finding strength and identity in the group. In an effort not to feel alone, we may sacrifice our solitude, the deep spiritual bond with ourselves, as well as our individuality. This infantile fear of the space between us can keep us clingy and needy and codependent. And this, once again, goes back to our earliest lessons in bonding and safety and emotional attachment. If we learned as children that our primary caretaker was present enough to keep us safe without our feeling smothered, we tend to feel more comfortable with detachment from others and emotional space in our relationships later on. If we didn't feel safe as kids, or sufficiently attended to or seen or held for who we are, we tend to develop insecure attachment and a tendency to doubt other people, to fear separation, to distrust autonomy, not only other people's, but ours as well as a lifelong desire to close the gap and merge with those we care about. This tendency to fear the space between us it's a serious detriment to intimacy and emotional health and balance. It's also a doomed effort, because no matter how close you are to another person, you will always be an individual. You can't climb back into your mother's womb and restore that umbilical connection, even though that's exactly what many people try to do in their relationships without necessarily realizing it. Prove to me that we're connected. Protect me from my fear of being alone. These kinds of messages are the kiss of death when it comes to love connections of any kind. No one has said this better than Rainer Maria Rilke in his famous passage from Letter to a Young Poet. He says, quote, "A good marriage," and this could be as well a good relationship, "is one in which each partner appoints the other to be the guardian of his solitude, and thus they show each other the greatest possible trust. A merging of two people is an impossibility, and where it seems to exist, it is a hemming in, a mutual consent that robs one party or both parties of their fullest freedom and development. But once the realization is accepted that even between the closest people, infinite distances exist, a marvelous living side by side can grow up for them, if they succeed in loving the expanse between them, which gives them the possibility of seeing each other as a whole and before an immense sky." Isn't that gorgeous? I'm just going to read the end again. "A merging of two people is an impossibility, and where it seems to exist, it is a hemming in, a mutual consent that robs one party or both parties of their fullest freedom and development. But once the realization is accepted that even between the closest people, infinite distances exist, a marvelous living side by side can grow up for them. The space allows us to see one another, as Rilke puts it, as whole before an immense sky." So ask yourself, can you tolerate distance in relationships? Are you able to stand on your own while also being present and intimate? Do you have trouble trusting that others care about you, and that even out of sight, you're not out of mind? These are excellent questions to look into around space and relationships. And finally, we come to the final and fifth practice, learning to tolerate fundamental connection. Now, that may sound contradictory in light of what I've just been saying about the need to tolerate distance. But in fact, these 2 points are completely linked, because our discomfort with separation is the flip side of our discomfort with connection. While it's scary to realize that we're alone, that this ego is its own country, so to speak, that this small self will fade and die, It's equally anathema to admit for the ego that it's a fraction of who we are, and that in fact there is no separate me in the final analysis, that we couldn't disconnect even if we wanted to. Egos want it both ways. You know, while the ego cherishes the illusion of independence and sovereignty, it is also very often terrified of autonomy at the same time. While egos long for connection and intimacy, they also reject this very connection for fear that they will lose themselves. It's a no-win situation for the ego, which is why we embark on spiritual work in the first place, you know, to liberate ourselves from this paranoid bully, this tyrannical ego, in order to know ourselves and finally be free. Then we can live with both space and connection. You know, freedom to express our originality alongside the spiritual awareness that each of us is a unique cell in the greater body, you know, a single voice in the chorus. The more we learn to live in this paradox of being both individual and always connected, of being body and spirit, the closer we come to a mindful balance that can ground us in our experience while leaving space for all that we don't understand. So ask yourself, how do you deny your connection to others? You know, how do you where in your life do you have trouble accepting intimacy and accepting non-separation? Why does connection become intolerable for you sometimes? You know, what do you feel that you're losing? This is a useful inquiry as well. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about originality and imitation. And I'd like to know from you now, is tolerance a challenge for you in your life? And in what areas of life in particular, and why?